Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this presentation. Today we're going to be discussing triage techniques with W4. My name is Mel Ortiz and I'll be presenting for you today. So just a quick overview of what we'll discuss. We're going to go over types of triage, preparation for triage, and some of the steps that you should be taking before you go out in the field. Benefits of conducting triage, such as increased efficiency. Important things to consider when you're out in the field, things like encryption and securing devices. Then finally, I'll do a quick demo with our forensic triage tool, W4. So triage is basically the first step in the digital forensic process, and it comes in two forms, live and dead box. Generally, when we say triage, we mean live triage. This is where most of the focus will be for this specific presentation. Live triage is what you do when you're out in the field, possibly executing a search warrant, and you probably have a bunch of different devices that are up and running. Basically, you want to examine them before you power them off and collect them. So the goal is to identify and collect the digital devices, extract responsive data as quickly as possible, and then use any information gained to prioritize what to examine next and to determine what next steps to take on site. Then you also have dead box, where it's typically done at the lab after all the evidence has already been collected. The goal here is to basically determine what should be examined first by ranking each device based on which is likely to contain responsive data that we're looking for. We typically don't have the time to examine and do a deep dive on everything, so you want to make sure you don't spend too much time on things that are unlikely to have anything responsive on them. Triage preparation. Typically, you don't have a lot of time to prepare. A typical scenario when I was working in law enforcement is that we'll get a message at like 4:45 p.m. that there will be a search warrant at like 5 a.m. the next morning, and they need an analyst on site. So we basically have to scramble to find out what's going on. It can be a pain, but this preparation period between that moment and the next morning is crucial. You want to know the whole story so that you know what it is that you're looking for when you get there. You can find a lot of this information in your police reports, NCMEC cyber tips, things like that. There'll be a lot of wasted time if you wait to do this on site, so you definitely want to get a head start on this stuff beforehand. You need to make sure you know all about the legal authority. This is going to be different depending on your jurisdiction and how the search warrant was written. Legally speaking, you need to know what your limitations are. Are you allowed to search any live devices? In some cases, you may only be authorized to collect the hardware but not view the contents. You may need to check the policy in your agency and jurisdiction to determine exactly what that means for your particular case. Considering a major part of your job is evidence preservation, you may still be allowed to check for encryption and maybe attempt to recover any decryption keys. For mobile devices, you may be allowed to keep the power to the device to keep it in an after first unlock state. You also want to check the search warrant for things like limitations on what kind of file types and artifacts you can view, any date limitations, what device types you can seize. You don't want to waste time figuring this stuff out on site, so try to get a copy of that search warrant the day before if at all possible. You want to meet with your investigator or whoever is overseeing the case so that they can give you an idea of what to expect. Some questions to consider asking include, what is the suspect's technical level? Maybe it's likely that they use encryption, anti-forensics, things of that nature. Information like this may change how you want to approach the triage process. What kind of digital evidence should we expect to examine? Is it going to be mostly mobile devices, PCs, Mac, external media, servers, etc.? This will determine what you need to bring with you, especially if you're working in a lab with limited equipment and you're planning on hitting multiple locations. You may need to ration licenses and equipment. Another important question is, what search terms are we interested in? This is really important for drug cases where suspects may be using different terms for the drugs. Sometimes these aren't the street names that you're used to, and in order to avoid having to read all the communications, it would be good to have the right search terms. This interview is also a good opportunity to educate your investigator on any opportunities that they may be missing out on. A good example is if you're dealing with a tech-savvy suspect. A good idea may be to reschedule the search warrant execution during a time that the suspect is likely on site and on their PC. This means that there's a much higher likelihood that their devices may be unlocked when you get in there. Finally, the last thing to prepare is your software. For software, this process will be a little different depending on the tool that you're using, but the general idea is still pretty much the same. Some of the things you want to consider are preloading all of your search terms. Like I mentioned before, you'll get a lot of these from your case documentation and from your investigator. A lot of people like to use the same keyword list for a specific type of case. They have a list of drug terms, a list for financial crimes, child exploitation, etc. And while that's all well and good, you need to make sure that you can identify any keywords that are specific to your case. These are things like account numbers or names, specific terms for drugs that the dealer's known to use. Maybe you know the file names for any contraband that you believe may have been downloaded. My point here is to just be a little bit more specific with these and don't just rely on a one-size-fits-all approach. You also want to preload any hash values for files of interest. If it's an IP theft case, maybe you know the hash values for the files that you believe were stolen. In a child exploitation case, if it's through a cyber tip, you can get those hash values for the downloaded contraband from the report. You want to include those hash values. That way, when you run your triage, it makes it easier to identify those files as soon as they're discovered so you can immediately preserve them. The idea here is that you basically want to be able to hand out these external hard drives or flash drives that you've prepared over to people with minimal direction while you're in a busy crime scene. It's a matter of plugging it in, do a quick search for encryption, capture RAM, then run the search profile, and wait for those hits to come in. Another thing to consider is making sure that you put any software you plan to use on fast external media. Your bottleneck for performing fast triage generally is going to be the read and write speeds of the media of where the triage tool is stored. In some cases, you may be limited by the ports on the machine you're examining. Some older PCs you may run into may only have USB 1 or 2, so you're going to be limited to those speeds regardless of what speed your drive is. In any case, the faster your media, the better. Obviously, make sure you have enough storage space. 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes of RAM isn't rare in some of the consumer PCs you'll run into out there. And if you're doing a lot of RAM captures, it may end up being a lot of data. So the main benefit to Triage is that it's more efficient. Most of you know that we've been getting an incredible amount of data from these digital devices, and it just keeps growing. Back in the early 2000s, an average hard drive size you found on a PC was around 20 gigabytes, where today we're closer to a terabyte. That's over 50 times more data. Another thing to consider is that back then, the average person maybe had a desktop and maybe a flip phone. Nowadays, you're dealing with someone who has a smartphone with hundreds of applications that can store thousands of pictures and videos. They also have a couple burner phones, a laptop, desktop, tablet, flash drives, external hard drives, smartwatch, Alexa, and probably an old shoebox filled with every old gadget that they've ever used in the last 20 years. Triage on site can also help with questioning the suspects. You can use your findings to develop your questioning throughout the search. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the suspect's story kind of evolving as you're executing the search warrant. It starts with the suspect saying that there's no illegal activity happening in this house. Fast forward a couple hours into the search and the story changes to, no, none of that illegal stuff that you found is mine, right? Then you go to Triage's PC and his phone and determine that it's very clearly all his stuff. Being able to get this stuff and develop that questioning on site is very valuable. If you're the kind of agency that's doing collections and examining everything in the lab, this is something that you may be missing out on. Better preservation of evidence. Once you power off that PC, you lose access to a lot of different artifacts that you would only have been able to get via RAM capture. This includes internet artifacts that were viewed in private browsing mode. None of that history is written to any persistent storage, so if your suspect is viewing contraband using incognito mode, the best chance of getting any of those artifacts is through a RAM capture. You may get lucky and get it in the page file or the hyperfill.sys file, but that's pretty rare. The other thing you can get from RAM captures is decryption keys. By shutting down an encrypted PC without a RAM capture, you're essentially throwing out the keys to the kingdom. You also get the ability to send out a preservation order for cloud data a lot sooner. If you wait to triage in the lab, it may be days, weeks, maybe even months later before you get any account names. If that data isn't stored locally, you may be out of luck. By that point, your suspect's sidekick already deleted all of his account information. You should have somebody on hand during the search warrant to send out preservation orders as soon as you find any account names. Those will come in handy later on. Let's go over some important considerations. What is the likely value of the data? You don't want to waste time doing extractions on evidence items that are unlikely to hold responsive data. That shoebox with the suspect's old Motorola Razor is very unlikely to contain any evidence of a recent crime, so that's typically something that you can move to the end of the priority list. For the kid's tablet, unless you want to see how many times they played Baby Shark in the last hour, it probably won't have much. I'm not saying don't examine these things because you also want to make sure that you don't overlook anything, but just make sure that you prioritize your time while you're out there. Identify the most volatile data. When you work on a live machine, you're obviously going to make some changes, especially in the RAM, which is extremely volatile. So it's generally a good idea to capture the RAM before you start doing anything else. If you start opening folders, indexing, those are all actions that are going to start overwriting some of that valuable data that we can get from that RAM capture. So get the RAM first, then do everything else that you have to do. Make sure to secure any mobile devices, set them to airplane mode, keep them powered, and put them in a Faraday bag. Encryption. It's becoming way more common out there. If any wrong moves are made during the collection, especially when dealing with encryption, it can mean the difference between getting the data today or 20 years to never. So you want to make sure that you have someone that can identify that encryption. This can be as simple as looking on the desktop for any lock icons, any running encryption tools on the taskbar, things like that. You also want to have a method to recover decryption keys whenever possible. One of the most common encryption tools you run into is BitLocker. It's now built into most versions of Windows 10, so there are a lot of people that are using it. If you ever come across a live machine with BitLocker encryption and you're lucky enough to have admin rights, you can recover that key by opening the command line and running a quick command. That's something I'll go over later on in the demo. You also may want to consider doing a live image to get as much stuff as you can out of that PC before you pull the plug just to be safe. It may be the last time that you ever have access to that data. If you can do a RAM capture, which is a pretty simple process, especially if you're using something like W4, that's something that you can later make available to the analyst, which can also help him in decryption. I'm sure most of you are familiar with someone bringing in a dead box that ends up being encrypted, and it's basically a paperweight. That RAM capture could have meant the difference between whether or not you would have been able to put that bad guy behind bars. With mobile devices, especially iPhones, you're going to want to keep those things powered on in a Faraday bag, and if possible, set them to airplane mode until you can get them hooked up to whatever mobile device decryption solution you're using. If you bring a powered off iPhone to the lab, like I said before, it's only a little bit better than a paperweight. In order to take advantage of a lot of these benefits, it's important to always send someone who is trained in digital forensics so that they can deal with any of the different scenarios that you may bump into while you're out in the field. If that's not an option for you, it may be a good idea to teach a few of your officers how to do a RAM capture, how to properly secure mobile devices, and how to identify encryption. And finally, you want to document every step. Generally, this is a non-repeatable process that we're dealing with. You want to make sure you have a camera out, maybe even consider video recording all the steps that you take on the screen, and take plenty of notes. So now I'm going to do a quick demo on how to use W4 for triage, and then how to identify encryption, and how to recover BitLocker recovery key. So we'll go ahead and see if we can identify encryption. This is a pretty obvious example right here. I have Veracrypt on my desktop, so the first thing you want to do is pretty much look for any icons on the desktop, any running programs on the taskbar, the background programs, and things like that. Anything with crypt in the name, anything that looks like a lock, that may be a pretty good indicator of something that has to do with encryption. You can also go over and look at your file explorer, and if you look at any of the drives on your machine, you may find some that may have a lock. In this case, this one is unlocked, and this is an encrypted BitLocker drive. In this case, it's unencrypted because it's unlocked. If this was locked, you're pretty much completely locked out of that data without the password, right? So in this case, because it is unlocked, we want to go ahead and pretty much get all of the data that's in here. You want to do a live image of all the data that's in here. and get that stuff while you have it, because once you unplug that, the next time you plug it back in, you're not going to have access to any of that data anymore. It's going to be locked. So you want to have that stuff, uh, get on that stuff while you can. The other thing you want to do, because I've identified this as a BitLocker drive, it's a pretty easy recovery, pretty easy way to get the recovery key for this. And it's basically just a matter of opening a command prompt window and running that as administrator. And in here, you just want to enter manage -bde -protectors, and then you want to put the drive letter. In our case, this is the drive letter K for the encrypted drive that we're interested in. Enter that in there, and then -get. And then that's going to give us this password here, or your decryption key, which you're going to need later on. If you decide to take a physical image of this drive, the only way to get in there is going to be to use this decryption key. At this point, I would recommend taking a picture of it and basically saving it that way. You could also copy and paste it to WordPad or something within your Triage Drive. I'm more hesitant to recommend that because that's just more changes that you're making to the machine. So I kind of recommend just taking out your camera and taking a picture of anything that you're seeing, and that way you're making a lot less changes and you're less likely to overwrite more of that stuff in the RAM that we're interested in. Now let's take a look at my Triage Drive. So in this case, I've made it very obvious that this is my Triage Drive by making a very clear label, W4-Triage. When you go out in the field, you may plug in this drive to a PC that has a ton of different drives, just like this one. So you don't want to be mixed up while you're in there. You want to label it something very clear so you can immediately click on it and know that that's your drive. So like I said, this is my W4 Triage drive, so I've moved over a portable uh, version of W4 Triage in here, and I have my W4 Triage executable. And to run that, basically you just double click it. And the first thing that will pop up is, would you like to acquire physical memory RAM now? And if you decide to do that, basically you just press yes, and it'll immediately start downloading the RAM from that PC and saving it to your external W4 Triage drive. So I highly recommend that you do that at this point. You actually want to do that before you even look for encryption or any of that stuff, because like I said before, and I'll repeat it again, the less changes that you make before you get this RAM capture, the better, because every little thing you do is going to be overwriting some of that RAM data. So in this case, I won't press yes because I don't want you guys to sit here and watch me download the RAM. So I'm just going to say no. And that's going to load up our W4 Triage Launcher. I'll just take 1 second. And that is now up and loaded. So the Triage Launcher, this is basically where you're going to enter some of the basic information for your case. And you'll be able to select the disk that you want and how you want to proceed with indexing and things like that. In my case, I've created a search profile, Montana PC, that's going to automate a lot of this process for me. It's going to enter the case name, the case folder location, the description, the examiner name here, and just makes things a little bit easier for you when you're on the field. And basically you're going to create your search profile, and I'll show you how to do that right after this. And the only thing that it doesn't fill in is your evidence number, because obviously you may be using the same search profile on several different evidence items, so you got to fill that in yourself. The next step that you also have to do manually is select whatever local disk that you're interested in. In this case, I'm interested in this encrypted and unlocked drive that we saw earlier. I definitely want to do something with that. So I'm going to select that, and I'm also interested in this drive that has the suspect's name. It looks like it may have some interesting things in there. You have the option here to check acquire common system and registry files from selected disks. This is a pretty good idea because these common system and registry files, they have lots of data that are probably going to be related to your case. So you can just check here and W4 will automatically get you all of those files that you can use later on. You can also select this option to index selected disk after the case is created. So basically after I press this create button here, it will immediately start indexing. So this is a pretty good option if you have a bunch of these external W4 triage drives that you've created and you want to give those over to a bunch of people. As I mentioned earlier, you're at a busy crime scene. You can hand these over to a bunch of officers and they can go find these PCs, plug this thing in, just check this option here, create the case, and using the search profile that you created the day before, basically they can just start indexing right then and there and it'll do all the work for you. They don't have to do anything else. They don't really have to know much. All they have to know is that they can do that RAM capture when you first launch W4, and they select the search profile here. They put in an evidence number and select the drives that they're interested in, and just press the create button, and that's it. Pretty easy process for the most part. Then you have the option to build links after indexing is finished. This is not recommended if the case is stored on a slow USB flash drive. If it is stored on a slow USB flash drive, you've probably already made a mistake. You want to make sure that you put W4 on a fast drive so that you're working efficiently out there. Note that in times that you would want to use this is if, let's say, you're limited by your USB ports. If you come across a suspect who's using a very old computer and he's got USB 1.0, USB 2.0 ports, you're going to be limited by those speeds regardless of how fast your own USB drive is. So that is something to keep in mind. And in those cases, you maybe want to wait to build those links after indexing is finished, and maybe select that option yourself. In this case, I'm gonna deselect all this because I want to run you guys through the process before it begins indexing. Go ahead and press create. So this is the W4 case tab, and this is basically where W4 is going to launch when you first run it. And before I do anything, I want to run you guys through how to create a search profile. So basically, you're just going to go to the file and search profile here. And this is a search profiles menu, and it's going to show you the search profiles that have already been created. In my case, I have that Montana PC search profile that I created yesterday. You have the option to export this or import new ones. If you opt to export this, it's basically just a matter of exporting the zip file, and then you can import it within another W4 triage installation. If you have several different external flash drives with W4 on them that you want to export the same search profile to, you can do that from here. You also have the option to delete or view. If you decide to view, it'll basically just give you a pretty quick overview of what's within that search profile and how exactly it's set up. If you press create, it'll bring you to this create new search profile menu. And here you pretty much just enter whatever information you'd like for your search profile. One important thing for the profile name, let's say, for example, let's put in the case name here. In this case, it's just 01 Montana. For a specific case, there may be different profiles that you want to create. Maybe you want to create a profile for the victim, a separate profile for the suspect. You may be hitting a house that has several different suspects and you want to create a different profile for each of them. You have the option to do that here. You can have as many search profiles as you want. So in this case, if you have a victim profile or a suspect, let's set this one to the suspect. whose name is Montana. If it's the victim one, you just name it whatever the victim's name is. Uh, and you can enter your the rest of this information in here. Then you have the option to keep your preferences for this search profile that you've selected before. You have the processing settings, and you can go in here and configure that here. When you select that, you have the option to change the processing scope, whether you want to look at the entire disk or just registry artifacts in the user folders. Just selecting the registry artifacts and user folders, you'll save a lot of time with that. So if this is a case where you expect to have a lot of computers, you may be interested in just looking at those registry artifacts and user folders, because doing the entire disk may take a long time, and you don't want to run out of time while you're out there. You also have the option to select different artifacts that you want to index. The less artifacts that you decide to index, the faster the indexing will go. So that's something to keep in mind. And you have some advanced processing options down here. You can process images embedded in emails and documents. You can opt to process archives, recover deleted emails and files. This is an option that takes a very long time, and if you're on the field, it may not be a good idea to select this option because it does take a long time to recover all those deleted files. You can index the full email headers, determine geographic location of emails, extract and index raw data, and index volume shadow copies. Also options down here which take a while. Um, so you can select those as you see fit. I'll go ahead and press OK. And then you have the option to bring in your tags, whatever tags you've created, and your keyword lists and hash filters, which are really important. You definitely want to get those in there the day before, have that ready to go, and you don't have to go around digging for these keyword lists or hash filters while you're out in the field. You can bring in your recipes and any reports you've created. So I'm just going to cancel this because I've already created one, but that's basically the process on how to create a search profile. Very simple, pretty easy. So now I want to go over the keyword lists. So in this case, this drug terms keyword list is one that was brought in with my search profile, so that's all ready to go. But if you were to add your own, you're basically just going to press this add keyword list button, and you can bring in whatever TXT or CSV file, whatever either of those formats your keyword list is. You can just bring it in automatically here. You have the option to alter the search scope. In this case, I'm searching the full text, which takes the longest time. If you're interested in just looking at the those file names or just the metadata, you may be able to do a quicker indexing process by selecting one of these options. In this case, I have a pretty small data set, so I'm just going to search the full text. You also have the option to search within specific artifacts for that specific keyword list. So if you select change here, you can get in here and just look at those specific artifacts that you're interested in. This is a good way to kind of save time, because sometimes you'll have things like, in my specific case, I'm using drug terms. You can search the entire data set for that, but it's pretty unlikely that you're going to find drug terms within the system files or program files, devices. Most of that stuff is probably going to be in the communications, right? Maybe some of the browser history, mobile data, and places like that. So you want to like deselect these so that W4 Triage isn't spending a lot of time looking for keywords, the specific keywords that you're interested in places where they're not going to be. So this is just a pretty good way to save yourself some time. Like I said, in this case, it's a small data set, so I'm just going to keep everything selected and press OK there. You have the option to search your keywords in case sensitive, regex enabled, and you can opt to highlight your hits, which I have checked because that's a pretty good feature. Now we can go ahead and look at the hash filters, which is a very similar process here. Uh, like before, this hash list was brought in with my search profile, and you have the option here to create another one, and basically you can bring this in as a CSV file. Let's say I want to bring in that same hash list. These are just a few uh, hashes that I'm interested in for some pretty important files, and basically just select the row that you're interested in, and you create a hash filter with that, and that's basically how I got the one that's created over here. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that since I already have it ready to go. Then you got to make sure that it's enabled, and then you have a couple of different actions that you can select from. The skip option is if you want to skip all of those hash values, all of those files that have that hash value in your data set. And this is really useful if you have an NSRL hash list that you want to skip a bunch of these irrelevant files. You have the option to do that here. In this case, my hash list is for items that I'm very interested in. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that tagged. And it's going to tag those items with whatever tag name you decide to put on here. You can put in multiple hash lists and tag them whatever different names you'd like to do. In this case, I'm tagging them as important. So once I start indexing, all of those items are going to be automatically tagged for me, and I'll be able to identify them as they're found. You don't have to wait till the indexing is completely finished. The second one of those is found, it's going to be tagged, and you can basically just follow up on that, and just look at those items that were tagged as the indexing is running. The next thing you can do is you can go into your specific sources that you're looking at. I have the I drive and the K drive that I'm both interested in, and you can edit any of the information here. Everything's set up mostly how I want it because I used a search profile. You have the option again to change everything that you selected for that search profile. So that's an option for you if you decide you change your mind once you get out in the field. Maybe you come across a PC that has a lot more data than you expected, and you think that the options that you selected for your search profile may cause the indexing to take too long. You can just go ahead and go in here and change those options. In this case, I could get rid of this option to recover deleted emails and files and process archives, and it'll probably go by a lot faster. And then you can also opt to just do registry artifacts and user folders in that case also. I'll go ahead and save that and keep everything else the same. I'm going to do the same for the K drive, just get rid of these two options so that it goes by a little bit faster. And then I'm going to select to index all sources, and that will start the indexing process. Note that you do have the option to stop the indexing if you go over here to the top right. So if you're doing a case where, let's say for example, you have a suspect that, or a victim for that matter, that possibly consented to a search, um, they may change their mind halfway through, and depending on your policies or your jurisdiction, you may be allowed to still keep the items that you've indexed so far. So by pressing that stop button, you can come in here and stop and save all of the items that you've had. You can continue indexing, or you can close and basically just delete those files later on if you're in an area where you're not allowed to keep any of that data. So that would all depend on where you're at. So once you do start the indexing process, it'll bring you to this summary tab where it's going to give you a pretty good overview of the data that's in your system. So one of the cool things here is that you have your keyword list. Anything that was tagged as drug terms is going to show up here, and anything that was tagged as important, which is anything that matched my hash list, is going to be over here. So I'm going to go ahead and select these important files that I'm interested in, and it's going to bring me to this tab right under the search tab. And if I go down here, it's all my items that were tagged as important. And I have two items from my hash list that are tagged as such. And you can go in here and pretty much preview what's in there. In this case, it's the kernel secret recipe, which is a very important file that I'm interested in. So those were tagged as the indexing was running. So you don't have to spend a lot of time looking at a lot of these other artifacts that are in here. You can just focus on those things that you're interested in, and it's a super quick process instead of having to dig through those documents and communications that we have in this specific case. We also have some keyword lists for some drug terms here where we have some hits, and it looks like these are all from a few different chats. If you go over here and you look at the events view, it's probably a better way to see your hits because you can see the actual messages. And in this case, it looks like we have some hits for some ice cream flavors, which is what our suspect was using for drug terms. And if we go over to the communications and we go over to the chat messages, we can see that whole chain there. So this is a good way to, once you put your keyword search in, everything's highlighted and easy to find. And, you have enough information here to kind of use for questioning the suspect. If he was lying about selling drugs or whatever, you can go into this and use this to develop your questioning with that suspect. And, when you show him this information, it's obviously more likely to have him, come out with the truth and admit to the crime. So another thing you can do at this point is check your links. In this case, we decided not to do our links, but if you do decide you want to rebuild your links, that's basically just going to File and Rebuilding Links. We plan on doing a links graph webinar at some point, so keep an eye out for that. You can also add reports to your search profile, which I didn't add to this specific one, but if you want to be able to output a report very quickly, you can make that part of your search profile, and basically it'll just be a matter of selecting your report and exporting the data through that report. So you can have that ready to go, and it's a pretty quick process that way. And the last thing I want to go over is this acquisition tab. So this is where you would go if you want to acquire data from the device that you're plugged into. So the first option here is the memory. At this point, if you decide to do the memory now after we've already done that indexing, that's kind of a bad move because we've already overwritten probably a ton of data within that RAM. You should have done this when you first launched that triage, that W4 triage executable. That is the best time to do it. But if for whatever reason you forgot, you can come in here and capture that. And basically, it's just a matter of saving that to your W4 triage disk. You can do as many acquisitions as you'd like, and they'd just be set here and go in order from first to last. You have the option of doing a physical or logical disk acquisition. You can acquire selected files and folders to a zip file, preserving the folder hierarchy and timestamps, which is pretty useful. This is much faster than doing the physical or logical disk. You can select, pick and choose which folders you want to do. If you're only interested in a specific user folder or specific files within that user folder, you can opt to do that, and it's a much quicker acquisition. You also have the option to do common system files, acquire common system and registry files to a zip file, preserving folder hierarchy and timestamps. In this case, I'm going to do a quick folder acquisition. And in this case, basically, you just select an image name. In this case, let's just put the Montana PC for the image name. And for the destination folder, I'm just going to scroll down to my W4 triage disk, and we can put that in this folder that I created earlier. And I'm just going to select that folder. And now we can select whatever folder or drive we'd like to put in here. In this case, I'm interested in this encrypted and unlocked drive again because who knows if we'll ever be able to access this stuff again. We do have that decryption key, but we want to play it safe and just export all of these folders and files from in here just to make sure. So you can do a shift and select everything that's within that folder, add selected, and that'll put everything in this files and folders to acquire section. And at this point, you just press acquire evidence and it'll start that acquisition process for you. And like I said, while that's running, you can go ahead, go in here and do another acquisition if you'd like. If you want to do this common system files, this is a pretty easy process. So let's do Montana PC common files. And then you select the physical drive for wherever you want those files. In this case, I can select my local disk and the destination folder, which will again be my W4 Triage Drive, and we can make a new folder for this one. Just name that common files. Select that, and then you have some options for the hash type that you'd like to do and whether or not you'd like that verified. I'm going to keep all of that default, and you can enter your some more information here about the case if you'd like. And I'm going to go ahead and acquire evidence, and that'll just be queued behind this folder acquisition. So like I said, you can have multiple things going on here, and it'll just go through the process to get you all of those acquisitions that you're interested in. So that pretty much concludes the presentation. If you have any questions or if you'd like to be a part of our W4 beta testing team, you can reach out to me directly at mel.ortiz@vound-software.com. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and enjoy your day.